Chapter 18. Daniel wasn't ashamed to admit he was scared. Alyssa was dead. Michael had killed her. Daniel's imagination was working overtime as it reenacted her final moments. Why? He wondered. We're the good guys. We're not supposed to die like this. If we have to die, we're supposed to go out in a heroic act, and it's not supposed to be painful. Not like that. He hoped she didn't feel any pain, being slammed against a wall. Please let her death have been quick. The theme music from the video game had been turned off minutes ago. It had only made Daniel sadder. He glanced at Dee, standing in the middle of the armory. If only he had finished the robot, they could have taken it with them. It would have protected them, protected Alyssa. Daniel hated thinking of her now that she was gone, but he couldn't help it. She hadn't deserved what happened to her. None of them did, but most of all her. She hadn't been cut out for this line of work, if you could even call it work. No, it wasn't a job. What was it? A hobby? No. Daniel cursed himself for even thinking that. Alyssa didn't die because of a hobby. She died trying to make the world safer, trying to rid it of monsters that should not exist in the first place. She had been trying to do the right thing. She was the reason he had joined in the first place. She had always said he was the smartest person she knew. Daniel grabbed a screwdriver and went over to Dee. He was determined to finish this thing. He wasn't going to let anyone else die if he could help it. He couldn't figure out what was wrong, though. Why wouldn't Dee respond to any of his commands? The robot just stood there, staring straight ahead. It was a 400-pound paperweight. Daniel couldn't stand to look at it anymore. He threw the screwdriver across the room, knocking over a bunch of papers from his work table. Crap! He went over to pick them up. On the floor were his schematics for Dee, as well as a book on robotics. He had built Dee using his natural intellect he'd wanted to apply to making video games. That's all he ever wanted to be, a video game designer. He had barely even glimpsed at the book while constructing his broken masterpiece. He had wanted to make it look human, but he didn't have the resources to do so. Also, Alyssa had insisted it wasn't important to make it pretty, just functional. Alyssa. He told himself not to think of her now. He couldn't help it. He missed her so much. He loved her. Ever since he saw her for the first time at one of his softball games. He had been too afraid to tell her that, but he'd always complimented her whenever he could. He always looked at her when she wasn't paying attention. At times, he realized it seemed creepy, but he was fairly certain she had noticed him staring once, and he was even more certain she had even smiled at that. But she wouldn't smile anymore. Daniel opened the book he'd just picked up, hoping beyond hope there would be something that would give him a clue as to what was wrong with his creation. He took the screwdriver and went around to the back of Dee's head. He was about to unscrew the back panel when he heard a noise. It sounded like a polite knock at the front door. He put down the screwdriver and headed for the door. Without looking through the peephole, he opened it. Michael, Alyssa's murderer, stood there, a smile on his face. Daniel slammed the door shut and put all the locks in place. He ran back to his work table in the armory and grabbed his cell phone. Another polite knock on the door. Daniel tried to ignore it. His heart beat so hard he could barely handle the phone. He couldn't remember which speed dial entry Chris was under. He pressed 2, but that was his ex-girlfriend, Amy. If he got out of this alive, he'd give her a call and see how she was doing. He pressed 3. Chris's phone vibrated in his pocket. He answered, putting it on speakerphone so Owen could hear. "He's here, at the front door." Daniel's voice sounded tiny through the speaker, but the fear in it was profound. "Oh God!" Chris screamed. "Don't fight him! Just hide! We're already on our way." He hung up, his face filled with complete horror. "You won't make it," said Nikki. "You can't help your friend." She sounded like she was in a trance. Chris and Owen left as quickly as possible. Owen's mind was already at work imagining what Michael was going to do. Hell, what he was probably already doing to Daniel. He had shown no mercy with Alyssa. He and Chris were hauling tail down the freeway a few minutes later. Cops be damned. Owen almost hoped a cop would chase them, calling for backup while he was at it. More firepower was welcome when it came to Michael. More knocking. No pounding on the door or anything like that. Just polite, patient knocking. But Daniel knew that wouldn't last long. Sooner or later, Michael would blast his way in here and tear him to pieces. Those locks he'd installed on the door were strong and plentiful, but that's not what was holding Michael back. He was just toying with Daniel. Daniel looked back to Dee rather pathetically. The robot was his only chance of surviving the encounter, but it still stood there, staring blankly. Wait. Daniel could have sworn he had just seen a flicker of light in the robot's eyes. What was that? A noise from outside the front door. It sounded like keys. Did Michael have keys? To the door? But how? One lock turned, then another, then another. Michael was unlocking the door. In a few seconds, Daniel would be face to face with him. What would Michael do to him first? Would he gouge out his eyes? Would he rip off his limbs? Disembowel him? None of those thoughts were the least bit comforting. His heart was pounding so painfully in his chest he was on the verge of vomiting. Another lock. Only one lock left. Daniel wished he'd put a few more on the door at that point. The last lock. That was it. Nothing more to do but open the door. And that's when the door slowly opened. Michael smiled from the hallway. "May I come in?" he asked. This confused Daniel. Could Michael not come in unless he was invited? That rule was so popular with vampires. Daniel doubted it was true for him. And he was right, because Michael slowly walked into the condo. I was just being polite. He closed the door behind him and looked around, whistling to show he was impressed. "Nice place," he continued. "Who paid for this?" Daniel didn't answer. Anger was starting to replace his fear. He felt Michael already knew who paid for it, and it suddenly hit him where he'd gotten the keys. Alyssa. Michael walked into the armory, looking around the room. His eyes finally settled on Dee. His interest was piqued. "Is that your robot?" Daniel still didn't answer. He wondered how long Michael would put up with this silence. "Why didn't you just bust the door down?" he finally asked Michael. "Because I had keys. Besides, I don't do the busting down doors thing. It's too predictable." Michael said all of this without looking at Daniel. His interest was completely on Dee. "Does this thing work?" he asked, picking up the remote. "Yes," Daniel lied. "Really?" Does it help you guys fight monsters? Daniel stayed silent. The fear in his voice would betray his lie. Michael sat down on a stool by the work table and stared at him. Is it going to help you fight me? What are you doing here? Daniel asked. Waiting for your friends. Why? Michael didn't answer. Instead, he just stared, a subtle grin on his face. Daniel stood close by, too afraid to move. That's when he suddenly remembered his rejector. It was in his pocket. He reached in slowly, grabbing hold of it. Why did you kill Alyssa? He asked in a low voice. I was mad, and she was in the way, Michael said, looking down at Daniel's pocket, the smile leaving his face. You seemed like such a cool guy at the party, Daniel said. Why are you doing this? I don't want to have to hurt you, Daniel. I like you. But if you pull that thing out of your pocket, I'm going to hurt you very badly. Daniel stood for a moment, weighing his options. Then he pulled out the tiny bomb as fast as he could. In a flash, Michael smacked him across the room. He landed hard on the floor and was still. Chris didn't seem to care for the red traffic light he was approaching. He cared less about it than the last 4 he'd sped past. Owen glanced at the speedometer. It read 90 miles an hour. They still weren't going fast enough. Owen gripped the dashboard. The cars they sped past were merely blurs at this speed. How far were they from headquarters? He looked back. There were no cops following them. This unnerved him. The 2 of them rode at a dangerous speed, and there were no cops around. They passed Dahlgren Street. 6 more blocks. At this speed, it wouldn't take long. Owen hoped Daniel was all right. He was a smart kid, and he had been tinkering with his robot before they'd left. Maybe he had gotten it to work. If so, it would put up a good defense until they got there. What would they do when they got there? They weren't much of a challenge for Michael the first time. Owen had thrown a car at him, and yet he still lived. But Owen figured if they were going to die, they would do it together. He just couldn't stand the thought of Daniel dying alone. They were in this together. They were passing Travis Boulevard now. They were almost there. Daniel barely hung on. Michael had tossed him around a few more times. Daniel knew it was only a matter of time before he would tire of him and end it all. But soon, Owen and Chris would run in, guns blazing, and take Michael out. They would blast his hide to the underworld. I warned you, Daniel! Michael shrieked as he threw him across the room. I told you not to do that! Daniel landed so hard on the floor, his cast split open a little. The trunk full of busters was right in front of him. He started to crawl toward it. The rejector he'd dropped was practically forgotten. Daniel didn't want to hurt Michael. He wanted to kill him. Suddenly, Michael lifted him up into the air. I warned you, Daniel. Daniel didn't feel the floor when he hit it at what seemed like 1,000,000 miles an hour. He was paralyzed. He looked up. Michael's face was expressionless. Daniel watched him walk away. Where he went, Daniel didn't know. He didn't care anymore. He wanted to spend his last few seconds of life thinking of something good. He thought of Alyssa. He thought of the day they first moved into the condo. Owen and Chris were carrying the couch through the front door, with Chris leading. Suddenly, he stopped walking and set his end down. Owen, standing out in the hall, looked at him quizzically. Chris grinned, and then Owen knew. He set down his end as well and stood there, waiting for Chris to make the first move. Daniel and Alyssa watched from the living room. Just then, Chris took off up the stairs. In one effortless leap, Owen was over the couch and right behind him. Daniel and Alyssa laughed as they listened to the two boys run around on the top floor. Owen said, "Mine," a split second before Chris yelled, "Damn it!" Clearly, Owen had picked the best room first. And then the two boys were laughing upstairs. No hard feelings. Daniel and Alyssa tended to the couch sticking through the doorway. They managed to get it in place in the center of the living room. After positioning it just right, they sat down together. "You don't mind Owen getting the best room?" Daniel asked her. "Not really," she said, shaking her head. "Besides, in my opinion, all the rooms are equally good. That's how it is with condos on the top floor in this building. That's why I insisted on getting a place all the way up here." "All the rooms are equally good?" Daniel scratched his head and screwed up his face, as if thinking really hard. "I guess they're just that stupid they didn't realize it." Alyssa laughed so hard she had to clutch Daniel's arm to keep from falling off the couch. Daniel laughed too. When Chris and Owen finally came back downstairs, they too laughed, though they didn't know why. "This is it, you guys," Chris said after the laughing fit subsided. "This is the beginning of our new lives as monster hunters." "Sounds exciting," said Owen. "Sounds scary," said Daniel. "Sounds cheesy," said Alyssa. And then they were all laughing again. That day, they were all happy. They were together.